Okay, so welcome to Wednesday's posting. This week we are doing part 2 of the point of social being. And last week we did part 1, the first part of a graph that we're going to be looking at. And I read from the glossary the point of social being referring to the core presence that we actually are, the center of ourselves that through which we connect with one another in reality and affirm one another's presence. That's always the case. If we pass each other on the street and we avoid each other's eyes, blank gazes, nonetheless, we are present to each other to the extent that we're doing the avoiding. And our aspiration is to fully enter into each other's presence, to become fully here, and to live in a social world in which people can be fully present to one another. And we live in a world in which that is not the case for the most part. So what we looked at in the graph, in the first part of the graph, were the 2 dots that are there that are connected by the black line, the full black line, that is that's meant to indicate our presence to one another, our full presence to one another. And the dotted line is the false self, or the persona that through which we enact ourselves over the course of our conditioning, through which we become, in my case, a boy, raise my hand at school, gradually become the person that my parents saw. I become the way that I am recognized and identify that as me. But the me that I actually am is the center of myself, the point of my social being, always present, always seeking to more fully realize himself, in my case. And so the bottom half of the graph that we went over last week shows the connection point of the point of social being in 2 of us, and the dotted line is where we meet through the medium of the personas that we enact through the false self, and the tangent point is where we normally exist, both as the false self there, where the dotted lines touch each other, and underneath that, unconsciously, but still fully present, our full awareness of one another that longs to more fully realize itself through social movements, responding to disasters, points where we suddenly emerge from our isolation or our separation and enter fully into each other's presence. Today, what we're going to look at is the top part of the graph, which is the triangular part, rising above the dotted line, the dotted circles, and the overall dotted line that provides what I call the horizon of the false self, the envelope within which our personae exist. So let's start with the triangle piece of the graph. The false self, to the extent that I am enacting myself in the ways that I was describing, I'm becoming the Peter Gabel that I was seen as. That persona floats on the outside of me. It lacks being. It's just the image of how I was seen by the other. It carries a portion of my true presence, definitely, but it also embodies my alienation. Men don't reveal their feelings. They hold themselves more rigidly. They speak through more mechanized performative style. All the ways that I have been brought up, it's a good word, brought up out of my original fully present birth, to the extent that that has fostered my separation from others, to that extent, I'm inhabiting a false self that I'm not aware is false. And so that's what the dotted line is. And the black line is my unconscious, nevertheless, a full awareness of the full presence of the other person, longing to fully realize itself in the ways that I've said. Now, to the extent that this false self is floating, it lacks being, to that extent, it needs to be grounded somehow. And the way that the false self grounds itself is by imagining that it is underneath some higher authority that is decreeing that it be the way that it actually is. And there's actually some truth to that, because when we are thrown into our persona or our false self, somebody is doing that to us. Somebody is perceiving us in the form of an image that says, this is how you're supposed to be, little Peter, little boy. And so we come to imagine that we exist under a projected author of the false self, and we behave in accordance with that authority that we imagine is higher than we are. That's why people, to the extent that this, I don't know, infection of the false self exists across the society, that's why people act underneath, they inhabit it, they enact a certain underneathness in relationship to the world. They're not fully there, but rather are underneath the world. If the judge comes into the house here, I might initially think, whoa, that's the judge, and move down a tiny bit in my spirit, because I think a higher authority has entered into my space. Now, of course, there is no such thing as a higher authority. We're all on the ground here together as equal human beings at all times. But nevertheless, the enactment, the internalization of the idea that there is an authority is really an internalization of the creation of the author of the false self to whom I defer. If you believe in the ideology of your society, and as most of us do at some point, you know, America is this and that and the other thing. If you just accept those things, the act of acceptance is really a deference to the authority of the words, to the authority of the ideology. It's part of being underneath that projected and then internalized author of the false self that always exists with the false self and in relation to the false self. And that authority is an important cement in maintaining the society the way it is, and in leading people to always repeatedly defer to the world as it appears to be constructed, within which we have our limited place. Here's an example that some of you may remember. When the Parkland shooting took place in Florida a few years ago, and the kids there who lived through that emerged from the shooting, where several people were killed in Parkland, Florida. Those young people, angry, shocked, traumatized, suddenly became powerful. And they, if you can remember them, they went from being just high school students to being spokespersons against the NRA, against the use of guns, against this kind of violence happening in schools. You may remember the way they became fully present out of their studentness, where they were in deference to the principal and in deference to the whole society. And lo and behold, something happened where several of their friends were murdered by somebody who came into the school with a gun. And they broke through the internalized author of their false selves as students, or as mere kids who raise their hand and try to get into good colleges. They suddenly became activists, but actually fully present critics in a way that you could sense set the NRA back on its heels for a period of time that they have yet to fully recover from. Whereas the NRA, the National Rifle Association, had been completely dominant in American politics, everyone bowing down to it. Those young people, as they emerged with their sharp criticism and their radical experience, their presence dissolved in part deference to the authority system of which the NRA was a part. So I give that as an example. And the construction of this graph here is that it's meant to show that the false self, the circle, dotted line circle, always creates an authority to which it defers and which provides it with its ground, because otherwise it's just like a doll on the outside of the self without having any anchor. It's a projected false anchor, the authority. And so I've said the outside elements are deference to the judge when the judge walks in, deference to the father in the traditional superego that Freud named of the role of the father in the family, but ultimately deference to the judge, deference to the president, deference to the whole system. When Donald Trump holds a big July 4th event at Mount Rushmore with the giant figures of past presidents hewn into, if that's the word, hewn into the rock, it's sort of like putting bigger and bigger externalizations of the authority into the scene to which everyone is to defer and under which we are all Americans, following what our founding fathers, as they're called, say is the lives we're supposed to live. So it's the reconstruction of all of that that can be manifested in the flag and in ideology in which people sense they're underneath something. They don't really dare come up for air and show themselves. They just obey and enact the part that they've been given in the story. That's the second part of this point of social being graph, is that the authority of the false self coexists with the false self. And when we become fully present and here with each other, all of that dissolves, including the authority, and we become present. We become present. We may end up agreeing with some things that are aspects of the system because we truly embrace them, but we don't obey them, and we don't see ourselves as merely passively enacting something we project above us and then internalize. Now, the final part of the drawing is the dotted line on the outside of the whole drawing there is the horizon or envelope of the false self, because what that means is that when you internalize the projected authority of your motions, of your roles, when you internalize that and seek to obey that projected authority, you have a limited horizon. You might see the world in terms of the nation state that you're a part of, and everybody does that with their nation, you might say, but we don't see each other as we really are across nations, as fully present, completely equal human beings longing for one another's recognition as truly human, as fully there, as universal beings. So there's an envelope or a horizon to the false self that is shallow, that is constricted by what the false self is capable of seeing consistent with its own existence and as part of its own existence. When you break past that, you enter a very spacious opening of freedom and of mutuality and of potential community and of a different kind of society. You can begin to imagine a radically different world that's more cooperative, communal, and socially connected. That's what happens when you dissolve the narrow horizon that you or we have been conditioned to accept, including accepting our place within, as we put it, and become fully here as a co-creator of the world we're trying to bring into being. So when we are struggling to live our lives in an empowered way, the goal that we have is to become fully present, and at the same time that we live the parts that we must live, to the extent that we've been conditioned in this world and are located in this world as it is, yet we exert our presence toward creating a new world in which a freer, more communal, more loving world in which we fully see one another and dissolve the dotted lines.